the person you see as most culpable in this?
Well, there are many people culpable, but Mr. Baldwin was the person holding the weapon that, but for him shooting it, she would not have died. So clearly, he has significant portion of liability, but there are others, and that's what this case is going to be about, assessing fair apportionment to whoever's responsible for this senseless tragedy occurring.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, in this new suit, the true horror of the Rush shooting is revealed by animation, courtesy of the LA firm Panish, Shea, Boyle and Ravipudi. First of all, let me just say how impressed I am with the presentation of this suit. As someone who has studied law and covered many presentations, sat in courtrooms many times, listening to these presentations by prosecutors, this was one of the better ones. I'll deal with what makes a presentation better and why this one works so well. But I think one thing to bear in mind is we are living in the 21st century. We do have tools in terms of audio-visual tools, and I really don't think they are used or utilized enough in courtrooms, in court cases, in trials, in lawsuits. But you would expect a quality legal argument anchored in facts and common cause from two top legal firms selected by Matt Hutchins, Helena's husband, who happens to be a lawyer himself. The suit on behalf of the victim's family brings us to 5 lawsuits now in all. The first was by Serge Svetnoy, the second by Mamie Mitchell, the third by Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, the fourth, fairly recently, was by the Rust medic Sherilyn Schaefer, and this is the 5th and likely the final lawsuit filed almost 4 months after the incident on behalf of Matt Hutchins, Helena's husband, as well as Helena's son Andros. The fact that 5 lawsuits have already sprung out of this incident, I think, shows that the Rust set and crew wasn't a very, very well-oiled crew. If there is so much vigorous dissent after the fact, I think it's very likely the same dissent and opprobrium leading up to the incident actually played into the events of the incident itself. And almost all the lawsuits reflect this, a chaotic rush set and a reckless approach to safety and protocols. It's also clear now why the 5th and final lawsuit took so long to file. Animation isn't cheap or easy, and the very impressive presentation by Brian Panish of Panish, Shea, Boyle and Ravipudi, an LA-based law firm specializing in wrongful death suits, includes a visceral animation that really exposes the shocking moment in realistic detail. In this analysis, we're going to compare, juxtapose and evaluate not only the animation video presented yesterday, but also Baldwin's original version of events, as told to ABC News 2.5 months ago now, on December 3rd. No surprise, the law firm used that very interview to bolster their case against Baldwin. You actually see Baldwin in the sort of top left corner of their video, of the lawsuit video, contrasting what he said with what actually happened. It's also abundantly clear from the animation and from the suit itself that this particular legal action seems to target and highlight Baldwin more so than any of the others. It feels like, from the wording of the suit and the orientation of the animation, that Baldwin emerges here as a kind of prime antagonist, and you also get a sense of that where the reporter asked the question. I played that clip at the beginning of this particular episode. He's also mentioned first at the very top of the suit rather than conflated anonymously with the quote-unquote Rust producers. You may recall Baldwin saying on ABC News that someone is responsible but not him. The Hutchins suit seems to contradict that sentiment. Nevertheless, one's got to be careful talking about responsibility. It has to be proven. And interestingly, one of the first news stories covering this was from Fox News, describing the new suit as showing Baldwin being quote-unquote responsible. I think the article was originally titled Alec Baldwin, others, and then in inverted commas, responsible for Helena Hutchins' death in Rush shooting. and the link to that particular story, kind of unambiguously stating that they thought Baldwin was responsible, or that they were restating that was quickly taken down. And so it has by no means been proven that he's responsible. That is what this lawsuit is all about, trying to make the case for responsibility, and not just that, apportioning responsibility to the various players in this. Included in the lawsuit by Hutchins' counsel are, besides Baldwin, also Sarah Zachary, Dave Halls, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, Seth Kenny, etc. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's get down to brass tacks. But before we do, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So number one, Baldwin's version keeps the focus on him. You really want to watch at least from 2 minutes 52 from the ABC News interview. It's the second one of the 3 on YouTube. I'll put a link to that in the description. You really want to watch from exactly 2 minutes 52 to get a sense of how Baldwin consciously or unconsciously, purposefully or accidentally, seems to sort of hypnotize the audience by disconnecting himself from the other folks in the church, or conversely, disconnects them from him. Here's what I mean. You have Baldwin role-playing himself, pointing and cocking the gun, and then he admits, I let go of the hammer and the gun goes off. Then he says it again, I let go of the hammer and the gun goes off. And this is the critical part. He sort of leaves it at that. He doesn't say what happens to Helena, what he sees going on in front of him. He talks about that, and then the conversation sort of stops and hovers around the technical aspects regarding that. Where was his finger? What did he think, etc., etc. And the host is actually confused at this point. It's like, is that it? He has to ask Baldwin if this was the moment that the incident happened. And from there, the discussion goes kind of backwards to whether Baldwin's finger was on the trigger, whether he pulled the trigger, and whether Baldwin actually pointed the weapon at anyone. He kind of says, I would never point a gun at someone and pull the trigger. He also says something about, I was taught not to go click, 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 and, the incremental damage. And all of this is sort of muddying and murking the reality of shooting someone, if you know what I'm saying. And you're only going to get a sense of that if you go to that video at 2:52 and you really watch the next 2 to 3 minutes and pay attention to, is Helena mentioned? So the gun goes off, what happens to Helena? And that part is sort of, it's almost like the room has turned dark and you just don't see her or hear her. And the focus, the spotlight is just on Alec Baldwin and where was his finger. So a minute after admitting the gun went off in his hand, Baldwin continues to talk about his instruction. That's another way of saying a minute after admitting the gun went off, he still hasn't really said what has happened to Helena. Just before the 4-minute mark, after disclaimers, defenses, and justifications, Baldwin continues with his story saying, everyone is horrified, they're shocked, it's loud, they don't have their earplugs in, the gun was supposed to be empty. Even in that, there's no direct reference to Helena, or even to the director Joel Souza. At 4:09 in that clip, almost a minute and a half after starting his story about the gun going off, Baldwin commences with the aftermath of the gun going off. And the only way he sort of references Helena is he says, she goes down. I thought to myself, did she faint? And so it's kind of just those 3 words, she goes down, and then instantly the spotlight gets turned back to him. I thought to myself, did she faint? Then he reverts again to the notion of a live round not dawning on him until almost an hour later. And so the spotlight's on him thinking about how did the live round get in there. And so again, the attention is just taken away from the reality of what happens when somebody actually gets shot. At 4:49, almost 2 full minutes after Baldwin has started his account of the actual shooting, the host interjects to ask about Helena. So, Alec Baldwin doesn't actually volunteer the information. The host has actually got to stop him and say, did you actually go up to her? Was she conscious? What was actually going on with this person that has just been shot? And Baldwin then admits that he went up to her, but then was forced out of the building. So, it's like he was on his way to do something, but then they were forced out of the building. So did he actually go up to her? And I think it suggests if he wasn't forced out, he would have tended to her, assisted her, and helped her. But then I think the question is, well, was he really forced out? And so this aspect is actually mentioned in the suit. It's the 70th stipulation. This is a quote from that. Ms. Hutchins said, "I'm hit." She said those words. So how could you think that she'd fainted? Why would you not mention that she'd said those words? Mr. Souza yelled, "Ow!" The Steadicam operator and the gaffer moved quickly to help Ms. Hutchins. Defendant Baldwin did not offer to help any, should I guess be of the victims. Medics responded to the scene. Ms. Hutchins was taken to the hospital. Okay, so the fact that Baldwin didn't render aid to Helena, and of everyone in the crew, Baldwin is arguably in the best or one of the best positions to try to help her or even talk to her. I think that speaks to the larger question floating around the production. I also think as the person who was actually, I don't want to actually even use the word responsible, but as the person who was the most directly sort of, what's another word for it, involved. So, Baldwin did something and Helena then became injured. As the person almost the most directly involved in that situation, you would think he would feel compelled to help, to do something about what is going on. And so, as I say, I think this speaks to the larger question floating around the production. Did Baldwin not render aid to Helena because he couldn't? Or was there a certain lack of care and consideration inside the church? Was there a certain lack of care and consideration after the shooting inside the church? Was there a certain lack of care and consideration outside the church after the shooting? Was there a certain lack of care and consideration in the sense of going back to life as normal, even though all of this is going on? Was this, if there was a certain lack of care and consideration, right, inside the church, was there also a certain lack of care and consideration before these events? In other words, the question is there a certain lack of care and consideration throughout, before, during, and after? Or you could say during, after, and before, or after, during, and before. In other words, throughout. I mean, consider where we are now. Baldwin is in the United Kingdom filming another film. Shouldn't he be dealing with the still rippling legal consequences before he returns to work on another low-budget film? The other thing to emphasize here is, imagine you had shot someone, let's say by accident. You'd imagine the way you tell the story is that immediately after the gun went off, you describe what happened to the victim in detail. Would you need someone to prompt you to get your narrative around to a description of the victim? Would you need someone to say, hey, okay, so the gun went off, then what happened to the other person? Or wouldn't that be the first thing you'd say? Because that is really the essence of the story. It's almost like a cowboy film where the person fires the gun and then there's no footage of the result of that. And if you think about those sort of, what do they call them, Mexican standoffs, or, those standoffs in the middle of the road in typical Westerns, can you imagine the gun going off and then the next thing they're sitting in a bar and the guy's talking about where his finger was? I mean, it all goes about the result of pulling that trigger, isn't it? So the gun going off is the starting point, and it should be brief. The rest of the story is the victim sustaining the injury, falling down, others attending to her, but not you. And as we see in the animation, it's obvious that she's been shot. She's actually said, "I'm hit," and blood was apparent immediately. We know that from so many of the other lawsuits. So it's clear that she didn't faint. So why would Baldwin say that? Why would he say, "I thought that she faint"? If she fell back, she said, "I'm hit," immediately after this discharge. And it wasn't only one person, it was two. And if he did think she'd fainted, if he legitimately thought, "Oh, did she faint?" why not ask her? Why not ask somebody else? Why not say, "Helena, are you okay?" Or ask somebody what is going on. Baldwin admits he stood over her for 60 seconds. Did he do anything besides stand over her? He describes Helena as just kind of laying there in shock. So she's kind of inert. He just kind of describes it almost as if she's asleep. But Helena was obviously in extreme pain. She was still alive. She was suffering. She'd suffered a mortal injury. She would soon bleed out. I've described in other videos what people said about her, the pallor coming to her face, her lips turning grey, her breathing becoming laboured, and her friend Serge Svetnoy sort of telling her to think positive thoughts and trying to keep her alive. And so in the ABC interview, the host actually has to ask Baldwin if Helena was conscious, and then Baldwin answers a little hesitantly, "My recollection is yes." My recollection. And then the interview cuts to the 911 call. It's just now we at last focusing on Helena, and it's like, okay, Alec Baldwin, are you going to talk about what you saw with Helena? Okay, so she was conscious, and then the interview cuts to the 911 call. So Baldwin remembers Helena was conscious, but he doesn't volunteer anything more about her. Is she breathing heavily? Is she lying on the ground? Is she saying anything? Well, we now know that she was. She apparently said, "That was no good. That was no good at all." The nice thing with an interview is that you can control the impression, the pace, the narrative itself by setting the scene the way you want to set it. You can keep the perspective that you want kind of restricted. It's almost like a camera, and you're not going to look in a certain area. You're going to keep the camera focused on the area you want focused. And now we come to the second aspect, and this is what I mean by juxtaposing the animation provided by the Hutchins counsel to this ABC interview where Helena is kind of extinguished from that narrative. This brings Helena and the context back into what I think is the proper context. So in his interview with ABC News, you could be mistaken for thinking it was just Baldwin and Helena in the church and no one else. In fact, there were around 14 people inside the church. I'm not sure if that's the exact right number, but many, many people inside the church. What the animation very clearly shows is the danger surrounding Baldwin holding the gun in the direction of at least 4 crew members. Something that I'd established from a lot of the interviews that I was aware of was that, they were only like 4 feet, standing 4 feet apart. And to say they are standing 4 feet apart and actually see it rendered, like in this animation, you see the distance that they are apart from one another, and someone actually holding up a gun, you realize just how dangerous that actually is. And so I know someone made the comment that, wow, until I saw this video, I didn't realize how near they were apart. Sometimes information like this escapes you and unless it's actually shown in a picture kind of thing. And that is why it's so essential and necessary to have visuals and audio, because we are so used to seeing things rendered in movies, on television, in YouTube videos. So why not have it in legal narratives? So when it went off, 2 were seriously injured. Sorry, that should be seriously. And this happened for several reasons. But one was that there were too many people inside the church. So one reason why 2 people were injured, there were just too many people inside the church. And that, I think, that itself was a violation of protocol. And then the second reason is the weapon should never have been pointed at anyone, let alone in the direction of a small huddle of people. And here you can kind of see that. You can see here he is pointing the gun, and there are 4 people standing right in front of him, kind of in the line of fire. And it's really unnecessary to have a situation like that. And so in terms of their slideshow or their video or their presentation, they say Mr. Baldwin aimed the revolver at his cast and crew within a dangerous distance. Now remember, in the interview he gave on ABC, he said that something like Helena asked him to point the gun in her direction, kind of thing. But the reality was he was pointing it at 4 people. He wasn't only pointing it at her, he was pointing it kind of at the director who was standing behind her as well. And Serge Svetnoy also came dangerously close to being struck as well. And I think Mamie Mitchell also came quite close to being struck. So they emphasize that the cast and crew were only 4 feet away from Mr. Baldwin's weapon. This just shows you that number one, you shouldn't have people standing in the line of fire, right? There shouldn't be lots of people standing in the line of fire. And on the other side of it, you shouldn't have somebody pointing a gun at anyone, let alone a group of people. Now let's go through a couple of additional highlights from the animation video. Number one, the video anchors its version in common cause, but it also provides a disclaimer that it is based on current available information. So in other words, it's not speculative, it's not thumb-sucking, it's taking what is out there in the public domain, and that gives them the freedom to express themselves without fear of opening themselves to legal challenge. And so this is the disclaimer. This animation reflects factual allegations, right? In other words, factual claims. It's not saying it reflects facts, factual allegations. So these are allegations, but they have definitely been made. It's not that they are simply allegations. So factual allegations in the complaint made by the Hutchins family regarding the death of Elena Hutchins. Also, so it's factual allegations based on currently available information. So that's kind of saying it is subject to possible change, also to possible fine-tuning, but it's basically based on reality. Number two, next we see Hall's hand Baldwin the gun, and Baldwin shooting the gun, or the gun going off in Baldwin's hand, however you want to describe that. Baldwin shoots the gun, or the gun goes off in Baldwin's hand. You can see quite clearly from the animation that one of those two things are happening. And you can sense the absurdity here in the contention, either that Helena fainted. That's the part that I think is quite important. When you watch the animation, you've got to ask yourself, is anyone going to think, did she faint? The other thing is, no one would have had any idea what had happened, really. In that scenario, do you think no one would have had any idea what had happened when you had some people instantly appreciating what had happened? there were people there who instantly knew what had happened, just as when you watch the animation, feels like you instantly know what happens. The gun discharges, there's this sort of, not only a recoil from the gun, but also a recoil from the victim as she experiences, the projectile going through her and then falling down. It happens at exactly the same time. It happens simultaneously, right? So this is not very clear, but there you see him handing the gun. He sits down. There you see Baldwin on the one side, Elaine on the other. There's the edge of his cowboy hat. There are the people on the other side. And then there he is pointing the gun towards them. Then the gun goes off. And then there's instantly, this is not really the best slide here, but you can actually see Elena changing position and clutching her chest, clutching her sort of side there. And then instantly 2 crew members come to her aid. Number 3, one of the most compelling aspects of the video was juxtaposing the warnings about safety with the producer's intent to continue shooting regardless. So you've got to bear that in mind, that it's not just that there were safety issues, but the producers knew about these safety issues and they persevered, they continued shooting regardless. There didn't seem to be a kind of an acknowledgement and an adaptation, a change in behavior, a pause to improve protocols or to observe certain standards. What you just saw was that they wanted to continue on schedule regardless of things that had taken place. And so the impression one gets is a rushed approach that leads to recklessness and a result that's not accidental but inevitable. That's the impression one kind of gets here. And so from this particular slide, the morning that Elena Hutchins was shot and killed, tensions among the crew and cast regarding safety on the Rust set had boiled over. This is something we dealt with in that series we did on Alec Baldwin. And then this was a really interesting slide. It's a text from Lane Looper to the producer, Catherine Rowe Walter, and he says, "We've now had 3 accidental discharges. This is super unsafe." And then the producer responds kind of sarcastically, "Awesome, sounds good." Almost like she's saying, obviously you're going to have discharges on firearms. Lane Looper then repeats himself saying, "Yeah, 2 discharges today and 1 on week 1. And so the emphasis here is that the crew had warned the production that the set was super unsafe. Not just unsafe, super unsafe, and it turns out it was super unsafe. Also that safety was a massive issue. So I'm not going to go through that, just that it's referring to the details of the conditions on set, fast and loose, things that were happening, no safety meetings, no explanations, etc. Then after the warnings of the unsafe production, the workers that had complained quit in protest. And this is the part that's important. The producers directed the super unsafe production to continue, right? So the producers could have taken a moment, could have paused things. The producers could also just have taken the complaints and the concerns raised as important. And imagine if they did. They could have saved themselves from their own production from being cancelled, from being jeopardized. Number 4, for me, one of the biggest revelations from the lawsuit was the attitude of one of the producers, Catherine Rowe Walters. Her name has come up before, and here it is again. This is point number 61. A few short days before the death of Ms. Hutchins, Lane Looper, a local camera operator for the production, made safety complaints to the producers. On October 16, 2021, this was 5 days before the incident, Mr. Looper told defendant Walters, a representative for the producers that there had been 3 unsafe weapon discharges and the set was super unsafe. Now get this. Defendant Walters responded with callous sarcasm, saying the accidental discharges were awesome and sounded good. Think about those words, callous, sarcasm. Number 5, another revelation is this email from Gabrielle Pickle, showing how the main priority of the producers was to minimize delays that might impact the cost of the production. So here she says, this is October 21st at 20 to 7 in the morning, very early in the morning. She says, Lane, good morning. Please call myself or Rowe, that's Catherine Rowe Walters, when you or your team arrive at Bonanza Creek. We will coordinate your gear delivery in a way that does not impact the shoot. Thank you, Gabrielle. And that brings us to stipulation number 66. Defendant Pickle's response on behalf of the producers, and this is the highlighted section, showed no concern or care for the massive safety concerns of the striking crew, nor did the production company's response deny the 2 accidental weapons discharges and 1 accidental special effects explosive. The producer's sole concern was that the camera operator's departure not delay the aggressive production schedule and cost them money. And so one thing that is really interesting here is that the producers were actually aware of these safety issues and obviously did nothing about it. But the issue is they did know about them. They did, they actually had no response to it. They didn't say, we'll deal with it or we understand. It was just sort of, anyway, let's just go on. The wording, especially in stipulation 66, is concise and eloquent. It says here, the producer's sole concern was that the operator's departure not delay the aggressive production schedule and cost them money. I think that's a very apt description for the approach to the production. There was an aggressiveness associated with cost cutting. It's difficult in theory to reconcile an aggressive approach with a careful or concerned approach to safety, wouldn't you say? In the next episode, I want to highlight the brilliantly scientific way Hutchins' counsel deal with proving their case. So, how do you show something like responsibility? How do you show culpability? Bear in mind there's this issue of, did Alec Baldwin consciously pull the trigger? Was there intent or not? So how do you actually go about dealing with that aspect? And you'll see that it's not really rocket science, but within the context of litigation and this issue of did he pull the trigger or not, I think the route that they took is nevertheless brilliant in its simplicity, and we'll deal with that in the next episode. So I'm not going to take it further than that. I do recommend that you go and look at both the video of the animation as well as the video of Baldwin talking about what he said that he did and what he said that he thought, and ask yourself how reasonable, how realistic, how credible, how believable you think it is. Bear in mind, later this afternoon, I'll be doing a live stream on Vincent van Gogh, the Van Gogh series. This episode that's coming up today is the 4th episode, and it's really going to be a good one. I've already written out the script for that, and it is really interesting content. So if you've missed all the other episodes and you've got a little bit of an interest in Vincent van Gogh, don't miss this episode. It's really going to be a good one. It is members only. I do want to keep it a fairly small group, just because I don't really want to be sort of distracted by criticisms and comments from people who don't know me and all that sort of nastiness. So that's really the reason why it's members only. If you want to become a member, there's a link in the description for you to join the channel and participate in the conversation. I'm also going to be doing a follow-up video to this one, dealing with the comments that the counsel made during their press conference, what was asked during the press conference and what they said. And that also promises to be quite interesting, unpacking the comments that the lawyers made, Brian Panish and Randy McGinn. So look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.